Welcome to Skinner and Chalmers Weekly Roast. Today, the root of all negotiations, Dezenzo asket minus safe plants demand better soil conditions.
Greetings, cherished listeners, and welcome once more to Skinner and Chalmers Weekly Roast, your auditory beacon in the sometimes bewildering, always beloved landscape of meme field. I am, as ever, your principal Skinner, and with me, my steadfast superintendent, my rock, he does collect rocks.
He means that literally, folks. And yes, Seymour, you were indeed attempting to cure out my geological specimens last week with what I can only describe as enthusiastic bewilderment. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on when Dezenzo finally wrangles this recording into a listenable format.
It was not bewilderment, Gary. It was an artistic reinterpretation. I felt that magnificent piece of gneiss was looking rather lonely next to the schist. I was merely fostering inter-rock relations and meticulous organization that rather neatly seeped into our little chat with Cogsworth in the Golem Union just last week, did it not?
It did. By little chat, you mean another to our emergency meeting because the golem assigned to polishing the silver felt the provided Chamos cough was, and I quote, insufficiently plush for implements of such historical gravity, Seymour, for your mother's grapefruit spoons.
They are heirlooms, Gary, and Cogsworth was very reasonable. He pointed out that Clause 7, Subminus Section B, Paragraph 3 of the Golem Union Charter clearly states, all polishing apparatus must be of a standard commensurate with the item being polished, or a minimum of 600 thread count Egyptian cotton, whichever is deemed more luxurious by the acting shop steward. We had to concede their paperwork was impeccable.
Impeccable and utterly exhausting. I believe this involves the designated napping spots. Apparently, the sunbeam that hits the West Garden between 2 and 3:30 p.m. is now considered premium napping territory, and there is a waiting list. A waiting list managed by Cogsworth, of course. He suggested a lottery system, but then Golem number 7, the one who assists with Crekateresis disposal, argued that seniority should take precedence due to, and I quote, volcanic hazard exposure compensation.
A fair point. One must always consider workplace safety and appropriate recompense. It keeps morale high, and their gardening work has been simply sublime since they negotiated for those artisanal watering cans shaped like mythical beasts. The dandelions have never looked so heroic. Much like Master Chief's prize minus winning roses, though, he has a different, more direct approach to pest control.
He certainly does. I saw him sternly lecturing a caterpillar just yesterday. I think the caterpillar apologized. But yes, the golems. It is a delicate balance managing the unionized workforce of sentient clay. Almost as delicate as trying to explain to Daviwa why he cannot mimic the emergency broadcast system tones at 3 in the morning.
He's merely expressing his artistic range, Gary. But you are right, it is all about negotiation, understanding, and occasionally providing superior napping locations. It reminds me we had a rather intriguing piece of listener mail that touched upon similar themes of domestic, shall we say, management challenges. Would you do the honors?
Ah, yes, this one is from Magpie 1862. Dear Skinner and Chalmers, love the podcast, especially the segments about managing your delightful menagerie. I recently acquired a small, allegedly house-trained black hole as a pet. It is mostly well-behaved, but it keeps trying to unionize my socks. It has already designated my favorite Argyle pair as shop steward of the Socktool Collective. Any advice on negotiating with an astrophysically dense entity with a penchant for hosiery and labor rights? P.S. Does Mr. Godgecko still enjoy sunbathing on that suspiciously warm modem?
A splendid question from Magpie. And yes, Mr. Gecko is currently enjoying the modem's ambient warmth. Though Mrs. Transgecko prefers the slight vibrations from the Roomba docking station. As for the black hole in the sock drawer collective, that is a new one, even for meme field.
It has a certain gravitational pull, that problem. My initial thought, Magpie, is to ascertain the black hole's core demands. Is it about thread count, elasticity, a desire for more varied colored palettes? One cannot negotiate effectively without understanding the fundamental grievances. Perhaps a fact-finding mission is in order.
Indeed, and establish clear boundaries. Perhaps offer a specific, designated union sock, one of those novelty ones. Perhaps. The kind you get for Christmas and never wear, a sort of ceremonial offering. Appeasement can be a powerful tool, as we learned when Bartheme Lowe demanded a tiny velvet cushion for his skull. He has been far less red-eyed during our recordings since.
He has, though I suspect that was more about the cushion muffling the sound of his teeth chattering than actual contentment. But yes, Magpie, tread carefully. Black holes, much like certain school principals I know, can have an unexpectedly strong pull when they set their minds or event horizons on something, and they do not generally respond well to poorly buttered toast as a peace offering.
That was one time, Gary. And it was a particularly stubborn negotiation with the squirrels over the bird feeders, speaking of stubborn. That actually brings us rather neatly to the main event of our reminiscence today, does it not? The day our dear producer, Dezenzo, arrived on our doorstep looking as if he had wrestled a particularly agitated tumbleweed.
He did have a certain windswept quality, and a look of profound desperation usually reserved for when you announce you are making steamed hams for dinner, Seymour.
It was a culinary adventure. But yes, Dezenzo. The doorbell rang with an insistence that usually heralds either a package delivery from ye old curiosity.shop.com, your latest geode, no doubt, Gary, or a minor neighborhood crisis.
In this instance, it was definitely the latter. I recall I was trying to explain to Cumulus, our pet cloud, that he could not rain directly onto the freshly waxed floor, no matter how much he felt the parquet needed hydration. And then the bell. And another doorbell ring, doorbell rings, doorbell rings. And again, it seemed like we just didn't care at first.
Such a frantic deal. I believe even Gizmo and Mr. Jellybeans paused their eternal struggle over who got the sunniest spot on the porch. I opened the door, and there he was, Dezenzo, hair askew, clutching a rather forlorn-looking potted plant.
Forlorn is an understatement. That plant looked like it had seen things. And it had a tiny sign, Seymour. Do you remember the sign?
How could I forget? Meticulously lettered, almost defiantly so, upon a sliver of what looked like a repurposed popsicle stick were the words "more mulch now." It was both pathetic and strangely militant.
Dezenzo himself looked like he was about to wilt. He sort of stumbled in, if I recall, muttering something about a delicate labor situation and how he had heard we were the foremost experts in meme field on such matters.
Well, after our successes with the Golem Union, our reputation had clearly preceded us. I must admit, I felt a light puffing of a chest, an expert. It has a rather nice ring to it, does it not, Gary? Seymour Skinner, expert in INSPRECI's industrial relations.
It has a ring, Seymour, mostly the ring of impending chaos, but yes, he was quite insistent. He said something along the lines of, "Help me, Skinner. Chalmers, you're my only hope. Please, you have got to help me. My plants are unionizing."
The sheer desperation in his voice. It was palpable. He then launched into this rather tragic tale. You see, Dezenzo, bless his cotton socks, had been engaged in a long and apparently losing battle with his feline companions. His cats, it seems, viewed houseplants not as decorative items, but as a personal salad bar and occasional climbing gym.
A common problem. I remember Mrs. Wigglebottom next door had a similar issue with her prize-minus winning violets and a Siamese named Jing Scott. The violets did not stand a chance.
Precisely so. Dezenzo, what he thought was brilliant problem-minus solving, had invested a considerable sum in a collection of cat-minus-proof plants. These were not your average delicate ferns, oh no. These were hardy, robust specimens from exotic locales, plants that had evolved to withstand well, presumably very determined cats, among other things. He emphasized they were safe for the cats, technically edible so the felines could munch away without harm, but the plants themselves were supposed to be resilient.
The irony, of course, being that their resilience manifested in an entirely unexpected fashion. He explained that these paragons of botanical fortitude, these survivors of the feline apocalypse, had decided that mere survival was not enough. They wanted rights. They wanted representation. They wanted soil. Better soil.
He said it started subtly, a collective drooping when the tap water was used instead of the bottled spring water he had initially spoiled them with, then a coordinated shedding of leaves onto his favorite armchair. But the final straw, the event that sent him scurrying to our doorstep, was the formal presentation of their charter.
Ah, yes, the charter, delivered, if I recall correctly, by the most imposing of the lot, a rather stern-looking rattlesnake plant which had apparently been elected shop steward.
Dezenzo said he found it nestled amongst the fronds, written on a series of carefully flattened birch bark I have no idea and bound with tendrils from a surprisingly organized vine. And the name, Gary, the sheer audacity. The United Federation of Photosynthesizers and Allied for local for 20.
Local for 20, of course. I imagine the negotiations for that particular numerical designation were spirited. Dezenzo looked genuinely terrified. He said their demands were escalating at an alarming rate.
It started, he explained, with a reasonable request for premium organic soil. Fair enough. One wants the best for one's leafy companions, but then it moved to specific mineral water brands. Apparently Perio was acceptable, but San Pellegrino was considered to mainstream.
And then the sun lamp hours. They were no longer content with the standard 8 hours. They were demanding 12 with an additional 2 hours of simulated tropical twilight for optimal chlorophyll production and, I quote, enhanced vibrational harmony.
Vibrational harmony, can you imagine? And the one that had clearly pushed Dezenzo over the edge was for relocation to a less feline-suppressed environment. They were essentially demanding asylum from his own cats.
The poor fellow was beside himself. He said the cost of meeting their demands was spiraling. He had calculated that the weekly upkeep for his leafy comrades was about to exceed his grocery bill. He was genuinely worried about having to choose between artisanal plant food and his own sustenance.
A truly dire predicament. And that is when he turned to us, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and sheer panic. You deal with Cogsworth and the golems. HED said, you understand unions. You are my only hope, Skinner and Chalmers.
And while I am not sure understanding is the word I would use for my interactions with Cogsworth, more like resigned acceptance of complex contractual obligations, I could see Dezenzo was genuinely at his wit's end.
Naturally, I rose to the occasion. Dezenzo, my dear boy. I believe I proclaimed, fear not. Your resident experts in negotiation and inter-minus collective bargaining are at your service. I might have puffed up a little, as you said, Gary. It is not every day one is called upon to mediate a botanical uprising.
You definitely puffed. I think Dobby even whistled admiringly, or possibly just imitated the sound of a bicycle pump. On the other hand, was a little more pragmatic. I suggested that before we started drafting any herbaceous accords, we should probably visit the scene of the well, the foliage fracas.
An excellent suggestion, Gary. A reconnaissance mission. One must always assess the terrain. Dezenzo looked immensely relieved, like a man who had just been told his prize-winning Petunia was not, in fact, sentient and demanding a book deal.
He probably thought our experience with the Goldens, who, let us be fair, are at least capable of verbal communication, albeit in very formal, legalistic prose, would somehow translate to negotiating with a disgruntled philodendron.
And why not? Communication takes many forms, Gary. A subtle rustle of leaves, a defiant tilt of a stem, these are but the unspoken words of the vegetative soul. I immediately began to assemble my negotiation kit.
Oh, I remember the negotiation kit. I had almost managed to block that from my memory. You packed that tiny, rather battered briefcase, the one you used to carry your lunch in before you decided that sandwiches were too structurally conformist.
A versatile valise, and its contents were carefully curated for just such an eventuality. I included a finely sharpened pencil for note-taking, of course, a protractor for measuring angles of descent, a slightly bruised apple, universal symbol of goodwill, and also a handy snack.
And a photograph of your mother.
Naturally. Mother has a very persuasive presence, even in two dimensions. I felt her stern gaze might encourage all parties to find common ground, or at least intimidate the more rebellious fronds.
I am not sure the rattlesnake plant would have been particularly moved, Seymour, but the sentiment was Skinner-esque. So, armed with your briefcase of questionable diplomatic tools and my healthy skepticism, we agreed to accompany Dezenzo back to his apartment to meet the United Federation of Photosynthesizers in Allied Flora, local for 20.
It felt like a true adventure, Gary. Like those daring explorers of old venturing into uncharted territory. Except instead of hostile tribes, we were facing hostile houseplants. The tension was palpable as we walked down the street. Even Sonic the Hedgehog, who was meticulously trimming his hedges after Gizmo and Mr. Jellybean's latest unscheduled topiary adjustment, gave us a curious look.
He probably just wondered why you were carrying a protractor with such grim determination. But yes, we arrived at Dezenzo building. He fumbled with his keys, his hands still shaking slightly. The fate of his domestic tranquility, and possibly his bank balance, rested on our shoulders.
The moment he opened that door, Gary, the atmosphere, it was thick with unspoken grievances. You could almost taste the chlorophyll-laden resentment.
It was certainly leafy. Dezenzo's apartment, usually quite a pleasant space, had transformed. It was less cozy bachelor pad and more passive minus aggressive arboretum.
The plants were everywhere, of course, but it was their posture, Gary, their demeanor. A particularly lush Boston fern, which Dezenzo informed us was the union treasurer, was subtly drooping its fronds over the electricity bill as if to say, see what your parsimony is costing us in potential growth.
And another normally vibrant fern had strategically shed its leaves to form a tiny, almost artistic barricade around the bag of standard potting mix. It was a silent yet eloquent protest against substandard soil conditions.
But the piece de resistance, the clear indication that this was no mere sulk, was the Venus flytrap. Dezenzo pointed it out with a trembling finger. It was positioned directly beside the kitchen tap, and every time Dezenzo even glanced towards it, a low, ominous click-click-snap would emanate from its straps.
It was the enforcer, the botanical muscle. Clearly, tap water was considered a violation of their newly ratified collective bargaining agreement. I half expected it to be wearing a tiny leather jacket and sunglasses.
Dezenzo whispered that this was what he meant by the Union War. It was not an outright conflict, no thrown pots or aggressive pollination. It was a siege. A very quiet, very green, very passive, minus aggressive siege. The plants, he explained, were refusing to photosynthesize at optimal levels. Their growth had slowed. Their vibrant hues were muted.
A botanical work minus to minus rule, essentially, and the demands see more. They were no longer just verbalized by a stressed Dezenzo. Oh no, they had escalated their communication methods.
Indeed, delicately etched onto fallen leaves, using what Diz surmised was some sort of aphid minus derived the ingenuity, were their updated terms. One broadleaf placed prominently on his coffee table simply read Evian or else.
Another from a rather dramatic minus-looking spidered plant detailed a complex schedule for misting involving distilled water infused with cucumber essence to be administered thrice daily, but only during daylight hours when the ambient humidity fell below 60-5%.
The precision was astonishing. Cogsworth himself would have been proud of such detailed addendum. It was clear these were not amateurs. This was a well-organized, deeply committed botanical collective. Dezenzo just wrung his hands, looking between us and a particularly haughty orchid that seemed to be observing our arrival with an air of floral disdain.
Kept muttering, I just wanted plants the cats could nibble without harm. I did not sign up for horticultural hostage negotiations. It was a fair point. He had tried to solve one problem and inadvertently cultivated a far more complex one.
It was at that moment, Gary, that I knew I had to step in. The air was thick with tension, the faint scent of damp earth and botanical rebellion. I placed my briefcase on Dezenzo's slightly dusty floor, took a deep breath, and prepared to engage.
I braced myself. Your engaging can take many forms, Seymour, few of them predictable.
Esteemed members of the Green Delegation, I began, my voice resonating with what I hoped was a blend of authority and empathy. I addressed a rather large monster Adeliciasa that seemed to hold a position of some influence. Perhaps the sergeant-at-arms, given its impressive leaf span. Let us parley. Let us find the common soil upon which understanding may bloom.
The rattlesnake plant, to its credit, did not so much as quiver a leaf. It maintained a stoic leafy silence. Dezenzo just looked even more panicked. Possibly because you were now addressing his houseplants with the formality usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or particularly stubborn school board members.
One must show respect for one's negotiating partners, Gary, regardless of their phylum. I continued, outlining the socio-economic pressures faced by modern apartment dwellers, the rising cost of artisanal fertilizers, the existential dread of choosing between a thriving spider plant and, say, paying the internet bill. I appealed to their sense of I assumed they had a sense of something other than thirst.
While you were delivering your oration on the existential plight of the urban plant owner, I attempted a slightly more direct approach. I knelt down, carefully avoiding the Venus flytrap zone of influence, and tried to examine the soil around a somewhat droopy peace lily, which I later learned was the Union Secretary responsible for minutes and leaf-based correspondence.
And what were your findings, my dear Watson of the window box?
The soil was a bit dry, admittedly, but not alarmingly so. I asked Dezenzo very quietly when he had last watered them according to their pre-Union schedule. He mumbled something about last Tuesday with the generic stuff, before the ultimatum. It seemed to me that while their demands were perhaps ambitious, their core grievance might have had some merit. They were, after all, living things with needs.
A fair assessment, Gary, but their methods so theatrical. I then attempted to explain the concept of compromise. Perhaps I suggested to a cluster of succulents that seemed to be observing the proceedings with a cool detachment we could explore a phased implementation of the premium mineral water, starting with, say, every other Wednesday.
The succulents remained unmoved. I think one of them might have been subtly tweeting the entire negotiation. I saw a faint glimmer on its waxy surface, and Dezenzo later found a tweet under the hashtag plant power reading it. Management offering by -weekly hydration upgrades. We demand daily due. Hashtag soil solidarity, hashtag Evian or else. The tweet had 3 rate wheat tests, possibly from other disgruntled houseplants in the building.
The digital age has truly permeated all strata of existence. It was clear that my initial diplomatic overtures were not penetrating their leafy resolve. Dezenzo was starting to make small whimpering sounds. He looked at me with pleading eyes, as if to say, "Do something, Skinner. Use your principal powers."
That is when you decided to invoke your experience with school disciplinary procedures, if I recall. Perhaps a work minus-to-minus rule is in order, you announced brightly. They perform only the most basic photosynthesis, no fancy oxygen production, beyond what is strictly necessary for their own survival, until an agreement is reached.
A classic tactic. It demonstrates commitment without resorting to outright rebellion. However, I fear the botanical nuances of a work minus-to-minus rule may have been lost on them. And on Dezenzo, he just looked confused and asked if that meant they would start holding their breath.
It was not your finest moment of strategic labor relations, Seymour. The peace lily actually seemed to droop a little further, either in exasperation or because it genuinely misunderstood and was attempting to reduce its transpiration rate. We were at an impasse. The plans were resolute, and your briefcase of negotiation tools remained largely symbolic.
It was a challenging negotiation, I will grant you that. The silence in the room was broken only by the occasional snap from the Venus flytrap and Dezenzo's increasingly audible sighs. I was beginning to think we might need to call in a more specialized consultant. Perhaps Swampai. He has a way with things that grow in damp places.
Or perhaps Garfield, to explain the futility of demanding anything beyond Lasagna and naps. But just as you were musing on alternate arbitrators, and I was seriously considering whether I could live with the faint scent of cucumber essence permeating my evenings if I ever visited Dezenzo again, you had an idea. A truly Skinnerian flash of inspiration.
Ah, yes, Codsworth, of course. Who better to understand the intricacies of union demands and the art of the deal than a fellow union leader? I reason that perhaps a golden minus-to-minus plant conversation, leader to leader, might break the deadlock in Termus Kingdom solidarity, if you will.
So you pulled out your phone, the one that still plays Greensleeves as a ringtone, much to the amusement of the younger generation, and you called him. You explained the situation in your uniquely embellished way, involving horticultural insurrection, Endfoes, and tectonic picketing.
Cogsworth, to his credit, listened with his usual stoic patience. I could almost hear the gentle whirring of his internal mechanisms as he processed the information. I emphasized the plant's demand for quadruple minus filtered Himalayan mountain spring water personally blessed by a meditating Sherpa, as Dezenzo had tearfully exaggerated by that point.
I remembered Cogsworth's response. It was utterly calm, a stark contrast to the leafy melodrama unfolding in Dezenzo's living room. He said, "Principal Skinner, I will be there momentarily. There appears to be a slight misunderstanding regarding the aqueous refreshment protocols."
Aqueous refreshment protocols, such elegant phrasing, and true to his word, not 10 minutes later, there was a polite, firm knock at Dezenzo's door. It was Cogsworth looking as imperturbate as ever. his clay features betraying no emotion. He surveyed the scene, the drooping fertilizer, the menacing fly trap. Dezenzo huddled on the sofa, me clutching my protractor.
He took it all in with that slow, deliberate scan of his. Then, as you were reiterating the Himalayan spring water demand, complete with the Sherpa embellishment, Cogsworth calmly interjected. His voice, that familiar, gravelly monotone, cut through the tension.
And what he said, Gary, what he said simply floored us all. He said, "Actually, Superintendent, their original request as per our minutes from the inaugural meeting was for desalinated kelp nutrient solution. The spring water was a compromise I suggested during the preliminary discussions to moderate their initial budgetary impact."
The silence that followed that pronouncement was profound. Dezenzo's jaw, which had been somewhere around his chest, dropped even further. You, Seymour, actually lowered your protractor. Even the Venus flytrap seemed to pause its ominous clicking.
"Our minutes. Cogsworth, I believe I stammered your inaugural meeting." My mind was reeling. The implications, they were simply too staggering to comprehend in that instant.
Cogsworth nodded a slow, deliberate inclination of his head. "Indeed, Principal Skinner," he replied, his voice perfectly even. "I was approached some weeks ago by representatives of this collective to assist in the formation and subsequent leadership of their bargaining unit. They had observed my work with the Golem Union, Local 734, and felt my expertise in cross-material labor negotiation would be beneficial."
Cross-material labor negotiation. But he is our Golem Union leader. He negotiates with us. For better polishing cloths, for premium napping sunbeams. The thought that he was moonlighting or perhaps sun-lighting as a horticultural union boss, it was simply beyond the pale.
Dezenzo just stared. I think he had stopped breathing. He looked from Cogsworth to his prize orchid, which now seemed to be smugly preening its petals. Then back to Cogsworth. You helped them. He finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse with disbelief.
Cogsworth adjusted his cravat a new affectation. I noted perhaps a nod to his expanding portfolio of leadership roles. Interspecies labor solidarity is a core tenet of progressive unionism. Mr. Dezenzo, he stated as if explaining the most obvious thing in the world. Talent and organization and advocacy should not be confined to a single medium, be it clay, mineral, or cellulose.
Cellulose. He was classing them with us, or rather with his golem brethren. I remember looking at you, Seymour, and your face was a magnificent tapestry of emotions: shock, betrayal, a dawning, horrified respect, and perhaps a touch of professional jealousy.
Jealousy? Never. More a profound recalibration of my understanding of the labor movement in Meanfield. Cogsworth, our Cogsworth, a titan of industry, a champion of the downtrodden, not just for the golems who toil in our garden, but for the very flora that graces our windowsills and apparently Dezenzo's increasingly expensive apartment.
Dezenzo just made a small, gurgling sound. I think he was trying to say, but they wanted Himalayan spring water, but it came out more like glass.
And Cogsworth, bless his organized clay heart, just turned to the rather stubborn-looking fern that had been giving Dezenzo particular trouble. I believe it was the one demanding its own miniature humidifier with eucalyptus scent. "Comrade Fern," Cogsworth said with a tone of gentle reproof, "we agreed the desalinated kelp solution was an acceptable baseline for Phase 1 of the Hydration Enhancement Initiative. The request for individual atmospheric modifiers was tabled for the Q3 review, pending budgetary analysis."
The fern actually seemed to unminus droop slightly, as if being addressed by its proper union, minus appointed negotiator, had somehow validated its struggle. Cogsworth then calmly began to mediate, not between us and the plants, but between Dezenzo and this fern, his newly revealed union counterpart.
It was a masterclass, Gary. He spoke of nutrient absorption rates, of optimal humidity levels for tetrapods, of the long-term benefits of a stable and respected workforce, was primarily engaged in looking decorative and occasionally demanding cucumber-infused mist.
And there we were, the so-called experts, standing by utterly dumbfounded as our own Golem Union leader, the architect of the Golem Charter, the bane of my budgetary planning for household sundries, calmly and efficiently began to resolve a botanical crisis he himself had helped engineer.
It was, in its own way, beautiful, Gary. A testament to the interconnectedness of all things in meme field. Who knew that the roots of the plant rebellion in Dezenzo's apartment lead directly back to the very same golem who ensured our garden paths were impeccably swept?
Indeed, it certainly put our little squabbles over Chalmers cloths into perspective. And the easy Enzo, well, he eventually agreed to a trial run of the desalinated kelp nutrient solution. Cogsworth even provided him with a supplier, apparently. There is a golem-run kelp farm just outside Mainfield that offers very competitive rates for union members. I didn't even know we approved such a project from our golems.
Of course there is. It all makes a perverse kind of sense now. And that, dear listeners, was the saga of Dezenzo's desperate doorbell and the unexpected rise of Cogsworth, interspecies labor leader. It just goes to show you never quite know who is pulling the strings or perhaps tending the roots in our wonderful whimsical meme field.
And it also shows that if your socks ever do unionize Magpie, you might want to check if Cogsworth is available for consultation. He apparently has a very diverse skill set. And on that rather unsettling thought, I think it is time we took a short break.
Indeed, stay tuned, dear listeners, when we return. Perhaps we will discuss Chalmers' latest attempt to teach Crapetta, our pet volcano, to play chess. It has been explosive,